People tell you grief softens time. They don't mention how it sharpens protocol. When my dad walked into my mother's funeral with his new wife on his arm, every rule I had lived by felt up for renegotiation. There's an archetype you recognize the moment a family steps into a public ritual: the presenter. He treats a ceremony like a stage for competence, not sorrow. That was my dad, Richard, 60, retired sales director in Columbus, Ohio, adjusting his tie as if the reception were a quarterly meeting. You've seen this man. He believes order is mercy. He'll see guests, shake hands, and polish a eulogy until the verbs click. But behind the polish sits a deeper script: control heals. When life tears at the seams, he stitches with structure. The new wife, Kara, fit the presenter's choreography too easily, standing at a respectful angle, palms folded, like a tasteful brochure beside a product demo. Then, there's the peacemaker child. If you were that kid, you learned to balance everyone's voice without betraying your own. I'm 30, a city planner who lives in a one-bedroom near the river, and my job trained me to reconcile contradictions. Neighbors want both quiet and nightlife. Drivers want speed and safety. A block wants trees without leaves to rake. Peacemakers make maps others walk on. At a funeral, this type becomes a quiet stage manager. Tissues placed, photo board straightened, slideshow set to loop. You tell yourself presence is enough. You tell yourself you can hold a room without endorsing its worst decisions. Funerals distill family systems. You get the roll keeper, the aunt who polices dress codes and dessert trays. You get the shadow boxer, some cousin who negotiates old grudges through whispered logistics. And you, if you're honest, become the historian who annotates every move, who signed the guest book, who avoided the casket, who stood too close to the coffee. You think you're cataloging for memory, but you're really making a fence against chaos. If you've ever curated a photo slideshow at 2 a.m., you know the feeling. You're not only telling a story of the person who died, you're telling the story of who's allowed to claim them. Mom died on a Tuesday in late April. Kidney failure, not dramatic, just relentless. We had planned the service at a modest funeral home off High Street, the kind with carpet that swallows footsteps, and a founder's portrait no one dusts often enough. I arrived early with the programs I designed the night before. Her quilting bees mentioned, her chili cook-off trophies tucked into a line. And I told myself that if the room felt right, we could all carry the weight without dropping it. You know that bargain. If the tablecloth lays flat, the tears won't ripple the wrong way. Dad texted, pulling up, at 10:07. The visitation started at 10:30. I stepped into the lobby, smoothing a corner of the memorial poster like it mattered, and watched the glass doors part. He walked in smiling the way men smile when they can't risk tears, and Kara followed in a navy dress, the kind that signals, I understand solemnity, without surrendering youth. In the hush, my body wanted to split into two people, planner and son. The planner asked where to seat them. The son felt a heat rising, a small siren. I took a breath and chose a rule to live by for the next hour. The rule I chose was hospitality with edges. It's the posture you take when you want dignity to win, but you refuse to be a doormat. In family systems, that's the boundary host. You open the door, you decide the layout, and you signal, without a speech, where lines live. If you've ever set the place cards at a tense dinner, you know the move. I greeted Dad with a handshake he respects, then turned to Kara and said, I'll seat you. Presenters love clarity. Peacemakers survive by providing it. First row was reserved for Mom, sisters, and me. I led them to the second aisle seats, close enough to be seen, far enough to avoid center stage theft. You might call it petty, but rituals need geometry. Put a person in the wrong row and the story warps. Archetypes were clicking like slide titles in my head. Kara introduced herself too brightly, then softened, reading the room fast. The companion archetype wants alignment. She mirrored my tone, asked where to place the flowers she'd brought. Bouquet neat, not extravagant. That told me she wasn't here to flex. It also told me she was auditioning for acceptance, the way newcomers do in legacy families. If you've ever joined a pickup game where everyone grew up together, you understand the choreography. Pass, don't dribble too long, learn the court rules before you shoot. Around us, the roll keeper vortex spun up. Aunt Linda repositioned the guest book like a border checkpoint. Cousin Troy hovered near the coffee urn, policing poor sizes as if decaf were scarce. Watch this in any room, and you'll see the deeper psychology. Control is grief wearing a clipboard. People cling to jobs because jobs don't cry back. And then, there's the historian, me, giving everyone a private caption. Don't judge yourself if you do this, too. Narration can be a brace. It kept my hand steady as I aligned the easel, as I tucked Mom's chili ribbon into the corner of the photo board where her laugh was mid-bloom. Dad found the podium early. Presenter behavior again. He needed a rehearsal, even in silence. He read the first lines of his eulogy under his breath, lips counting syllables. If you've met this man, you know he isn't cruel. He's efficient. Efficiency misapplied can bruise. That had been our last year together in a sentence. After the divorce, he remarried inside 12 months. Not scandal, just speed. Efficiency with feelings is like asphalt poured before the gravel settles. The surface looks solid, but you know it will crack. Standing there, I recognized his pattern in mine. He built roads fast. I drew the maps later. At 10:28 the director nodded. The room condensed. Chairs made that soft fabric sigh, the kind you hear in churches and courtrooms. I stepped up to check the slideshow one last time, but really I was editing my own script. My original words were safe, well-lit, childhood summers, quilting bees, her mercy with burnt cookies. Hospitality with edges demanded something else. Not a call-out, not a plea, but a frame. If you've ever emceed a meeting where people arrive with competing agendas, you know the trick. Name the shared purpose before the first microphone passes. I slid my printed pages beneath the podium lamp, crossed out 2 paragraphs, and wrote a sentence in the margin. We're here to honor a sinner, not a sequence. Then I exhaled, looked out at Dad, at Kara's folded hands, at my aunt's guarded jaw, and decided to start with that. When I stepped to the podium, the room straightened. That's the power of ritual. It makes even folding chairs feel like thrones. I opened with a line I'd scribbled. We're here to honor a sinner, not a sequence. It landed softer than I expected, but soft was good. You know the moment when a meeting shifts from chatter to agenda? That's what I felt. Air condensing, eyes focusing, the argument of presence replacing the argument of time. Mom was the center. Divorce, remarriage, rows of chairs, they were sequence. Archetypes respond to framing like chess pieces to a board. The role keepers relaxed when they knew order was named. The shadow boxers, the cousins itching to relitigate Dad's choices, lost their opening. Even Dad, who usually takes any microphone as a chance to optimize, leaned back. The peacemaker in me had done what planners do best. I set the zoning before construction began. If you've ever worked in city planning, you know the trick isn't stopping people from building. It's guiding where the walls will rise. I spoke of Mom's steady rituals. Chili on Fridays, quilting circles that turned scraps into gifts, how she carried grace into ordinary errands. These weren't filler anecdotes, they were anchors. In family systems, anchors keep storms from rewriting the shoreline. Without them, funerals become auditions for unresolved roles. You've seen it, the son proving loyalty, the ex proving legitimacy, the newcomer proving sympathy. Anchors stop the audition and remind everyone of the show already lived. Then came the handoff. Dad rose, his script folded in precise thirds. His cadence was rehearsed, his tone a sales pitch turned solemn. But here's what struck me. He called her, your mother, instead of, my ex-wife. That word choice, 3 syllables of restraint, was the most generous efficiency I'd seen him deliver. Archetypally, that's the presenter bending toward the guardian, allowing legacy over pride. You might not notice unless you've heard your parents weaponize titles before. When he said, your mother, my body registered a truce. And yet, Kara's presence hummed like a fluorescent bulb in the background. She clasped her hands tighter with every sentence Dad spoke. Companion archetypes do that. They measure the rooms whether by their partner's barometer. She looked less like a rival and more like someone caught in choreography she didn't choreograph. If you've ever joined a dance mid-song, you know the tension. Step wrong, and the whole floor notices. By the time Dad closed his remarks, the room was balanced but fragile. We had dodged explosions, but not erased them. The service moved into hymns and memories from friends, and for a while grief felt communal again. Yet, I could sense it, the next fracture waiting in the reception hall, where casseroles and coffee would loosen tongues. Funerals don't end at the casket, they shift arenas. and ours was about to move from scripted ritual to open-floor discussion, the most unpredictable stage of all. The reception was held in the church basement, a room that smelled of brewed coffee and sheet cake. If you've ever walked into one of those spaces after a service, you know how quickly the air changes, formality dissolves, and the subtext of every family system comes spilling out between plastic forks and napkin stacks. People who stayed quiet at the podium suddenly find courage next to a crockpot of meatballs. Here's where the archetypes shift gears. The role keepers morph into servers, lining up desserts, directing traffic, making sure no one skips the casserole rotation. The shadow boxers turn conversational snipers, slipping pointed comments under the cover of condolences. And the peacemakers, people like me, become floaters, weaving between clusters to keep the temperature steady. You've probably done this at work or school too, playing buffer in group projects so sparks don't become fires. Dad moved straight to the center table, his presenter energy back in full. He thanked people as if he were hosting a retirement gala. Kara stayed a step behind, smiling politely, but every time someone mentioned Mom's name her eyes darted to me, almost apologetic. That's the companion's dilemma. You want to show loyalty without stepping on history. If you've ever dated someone who introduces you at a reunion, you've felt it. That subtle question of whether your presence adds or subtracts from the room. Aunt Linda cornered me first, whispering, "She really thought it was appropriate to come." There it was, the audition test. Shadow boxers feed on validation, and she wanted mine. But I remembered my rule, hospitality with edges. "She's Dad's wife," I said evenly, "and she stayed in the second row." Not approval, not condemnation, just boundary lines. Archetypally, that was me holding the mediator role, refusing to let conflict recruit me as backup. If you've ever defused a workplace argument by naming only facts, you know how much restraint it takes. Meanwhile, stories about Mom flowed, how she once organized a quilt raffle that paid a neighbor's medical bills, how she made extra chili every Friday just in case someone stopped by. Each memory stacked like bricks, and I noticed Kara listening intently, nodding, even laughing softly at details she couldn't have known. That's when I realized something. She wasn't competing with the memory. She was studying it, like someone walking into a museum and choosing to learn instead of critique. But receptions always have turning points, and ours came when Cousin Troy, who'd had one too many cups of coffee spiked with something stronger, raised his voice. "Strange seeing Richard here with her," he said, eyes flicking to Kara. The hum of the room dipped. People froze, forks midair. That's the danger of open-floor arenas. One line can shift the gravity. And just like that, the careful geometry I'd drawn all morning began to wobble. The wobble spread fast, like a ripple through the folding tables. You've seen this before. One loud remark, and suddenly everyone recalibrates their posture, deciding whether to align, retreat, or attack. Funerals turn into theaters for unresolved roles, and Cousin Troy had just auditioned for the role of truth teller. In archetypal terms, truth tellers cut through decorum with rawness, often confusing bluntness for bravery. They can be catalysts, but they also risk burning the stage down. Dad's jaw tightened. Presenters hate disruption. He started to rise, shoulders squared, ready to deliver the kind of rebuttal you'd expect at a board meeting. But Kara touched his arm. That small gesture was pure companion, reminding him that escalation would only cement the spectacle. It's fascinating, isn't it? How sometimes the least established member of the room carries the most influence. You've likely seen it at work, the new hire nudging the veteran to stay quiet, sparing everyone a spiral. Eyes turned to me, though. That's what happens when you positioned yourself as the mediator all morning. People expect you to frame the rupture. And here's where psychology plays out in real time. If I sided with Troy, I'd validate resentment and fracture the room. If I defended Kara outright, I'd invite mutiny from the cousins. The middle path wasn't neutrality, it was reframing. So I said calmly, "Mom believed kindness had no expiration date. Let's keep the stories about her." It wasn't eloquent, but it shifted the current. You could feel shoulders release, like an orchestra adjusting to the right tempo again. The roll keepers pounced, redirecting with plates of dessert and louder talk about quilts. Dad exhaled, Kara's grip eased, and Troy muttered into his styrofoam cup before drifting toward the exit. In family systems, moments like that prove one thing: Conflict isn't erased, it's deferred. But deferral can be a gift. It buys space for grief to reclaim its seat. I drifted table to table listening. People wanted to remember, not argue. One neighbor told me about Mom's uncanny way of recalling birthdays. Another spoke of her habit of leaving a casserole on a widow's porch without a note. With each story, the sinner, the real one, pulled the spotlight back. Kara listened too, occasionally asking a question, never steering the conversation. I noticed, and I also noticed my aunt noticing her, the calculation in her eyes softening just slightly. Companions can win respect not by insertion, but by restraint. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that the balance was fragile. Funerals end, but the archetypes don't clock out. They carry into the parking lot, into the texts that come later, into the narratives that calcify. And as I stood by the punch bowl, watching my dad's hand brush Kara's in a small, unplanned gesture of gratitude, I realized this day wasn't only about honoring Mom, it was also about deciding what kind of family architecture we'd live inside going forward. The foundation was cracked, but what we built next would depend on how each of us chose our roles. When the casseroles were gone, when the last dish was scraped clean, and people began stacking chairs, the energy thinned. That's when the mask slipped. Ritual had carried us through the day, but once the framework collapsed, people defaulted to their raw archetypes. You've seen this after long meetings or family holidays. The minute structure dissolves, true patterns emerge. Aunt Linda cornered Dad near the exit, voice pitched low but sharp. She wore the prosecutor role, demanding justification. "Richard, it was too soon." Everyone noticed. He didn't flinch. "Presenters rarely do," he replied with statistics. "We married last October. She's been part of my life for over a year." As though facts could outvote feelings. But archetypally, prosecutors don't seek data. They seek acknowledgement. That mismatch is where tension lives. If you've ever argued with someone who keeps bringing receipts when you just want recognition, you know the deadlock. I hovered close, not to intervene but to witness. Peacemakers often become silent scribes, absorbing words to prevent escalation. Kara stood off to the side, her expression taut. She didn't defend herself, which surprised me. Instead, she held her purse like a shield and waited. That's companion restraint again, knowing that joining the quarrel would only harden battle lines. Sometimes silence is the most tactical move available. As people drifted to cars, the shadow boxers reignited. Cousins whispered in pairs, glances darting. The story of the day was already being edited, each person rehearsing how they'd recount it later. That's the historian function at work, but in distorted form. Everyone competing to be the author of the definitive version. You've likely felt this after a workplace conflict. Within hours, 3 different narratives emerge, each shaped by the teller's role. I stepped outside into the April air, cool and damp. Dad and Kara followed, moving toward their sedan. For the first time all day, Dad looked smaller, shoulders rounded. He said quietly, "You handled it well." That was his presenter's way of offering gratitude, evaluating my role like a performance review. And here's the strange part. I didn't resent it. I recognized the language he knew, the only one he could give. Archetypes don't vanish with awareness. They just become legible. But awareness carries its own weight. Watching them drive off, I realized the day had drawn new boundaries. My mom's funeral wasn't just an ending. It was a rehearsal for how we'd operate from now on. Who would hold authority, who would narrate, who would dissent. And somewhere between the casseroles and the whispered judgments, I caught myself asking, when grief is shared by people who no longer share a life, how do you decide which version of family gets to live on? The week after the funeral felt like moving through molasses. Work emails piled up, but my mind kept replaying snapshots. Dad rehearsing at the podium, Kara's clasped hands, Troy's outburst. That's the aftershock of ritual. You think the event is over, but it reverberates in fragments. Archetypally, it's the debriefer stage. The debriefer isn't an official role, but you've done it. You sift through what happened, you assign meaning, you decide which details harden into memory. Calls started trickling in. Aunt Linda phoned to check in, but really she wanted confirmation of her narrative. That Dad's behavior was inappropriate, that Kara's presence was an insult. Shadow boxers don't rest after the curtain falls. They refrain the play for their own audience. I listened, responded with careful neutrality, and felt myself sliding deeper into the mediator posture. That's the trap for peacemakers. Every conversation becomes another balancing act. You think you're holding harmony, but really you're absorbing stress no one else wants to carry. Dad called, too. His tone was managerial. Thanks for how you handled things. You kept it orderly. Presenters measure success in logistics, not emotions. If you've ever worked under a boss who praises the process while ignoring the people, you know the dynamic. I accepted the compliment, even though a part of me wanted something less clinical, more vulnerable. Kara didn't call, but she sent a handwritten note thanking me for the seat arrangement and the slideshow. That small gesture carried more empathy than Dad's entire monologue. Companions often intuit the gaps others leave. Meanwhile, neighbors dropped by with leftover food, and each casserole dish felt like a ledger entry. Grief rituals in small towns don't end at the service. They extend through Tupperware and pie tins, and each visitor brought stories, little parables that position Mom as anchor. She had been the quiet builder archetype, the type who invests in others without seeking spotlight. If you've ever known someone whose influence is measured in casseroles rather than speeches, you know the weight of that role. By Friday, I recognized the fork in the road. Either I let the post-funeral chatter define the narrative, or I stepped into a different role myself. Not the mediator, not the historian, but something closer to architect, the one who shapes how the family infrastructure adapts after a fracture. That realization didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy, because when you become the architect, you stop waiting for others to resolve contradictions. You start designing spaces where contradictions can live side by side without collapse. And the question lingering in my head was whether I had the energy or the authority to build that space when the blueprints were already scattered. I spent Saturdays sorting through Mom's belongings. Not the sentimental boxes yet, just the daily stuff. Kitchen gadgets, half-used quilting supplies, stacks of church bulletins. This work wasn't just cleaning, it was archetypal sorting. Every object posed a question. Does this belong to history or to transition? Quiet builders, like Mom, leave trails of practical items that carry invisible meaning. Throw out the wrong thing, and you don't just lose a tool, you risk erasing a ritual. Halfway through the attic boxes, Dad showed up. I hadn't invited him, but he arrived with a clipboard and tape. Presenter energy again, task orientation, no hesitation. He said, "We should catalog everything." Notice the word we. Efficiency disguised as togetherness. In practice, it meant him dictating while I lifted. Kara stayed in the car, which told me she'd learned at least one rule from the funeral. Proximity can inflame. At first, I followed his lead. We labeled quilts, tagged dishware, stacked photo albums. But soon the tension surfaced. He kept noting dates. Bought in '92, gifted in '07. Like this was an inventory for resale. I saw the same items differently. The casserole dish wasn't Pyrex, it was Friday nights with neighbors. That's the clash between presenter and historian. One preserves through records, the other through meaning. You felt it if you've ever argued over whether to keep an old sweater for its warmth, or for the memory stitched into its fabric. Finally I said, "Not everything needs a tag." He paused, pen hovering, as if I'd broken protocol. Then he sighed. "I don't know what else to do." And there it was, the crack in the presenter's armor. Efficiency wasn't covering pride, it was covering helplessness. In that moment, he slipped into the vulnerable father role, one I hadn't seen since childhood. Archetypes aren't permanent costumes. They shift when the script forces them to. We sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes. For a few minutes, silence did what words couldn't. Then he asked, "What do you want to keep?" It wasn't managerial, it was genuine. I chose Mom's recipe cards, handwriting looping across smudged index cards. He nodded, then tucked them carefully into my backpack. No performance, no agenda, just recognition that some things can't be measured by inventory. As he left, Kara gave me a small wave from the passenger seat. For the first time, it didn't feel like intrusion. It felt like someone respecting boundaries, learning where her place could be without demanding it. But I knew the family system wouldn't let it rest. Funerals and aftermaths always trigger the next conflict. Inheritance, authority, the subtle contest over who becomes custodian of the legacy. And as I watched Dad's car pull away, I felt the architect's weight settle heavier. The blueprint wasn't just mine to design, it was mine to defend. The inheritance talk started sooner than I expected. By Monday, Aunt Linda called again, but this time she skipped condolences. "Your mother's quilt should stay in the family line," she said, meaning her line, not mine. That's the custodian archetype, the one who believes legacy is safest in their possession. Custodians aren't greedy for money, they're greedy for narrative control. If you've ever watched someone fight over a family Bible or a set of medals, you know the power objects carry beyond their use. Dad took a different tack. He emailed me spreadsheets, columns labeled appraised value, potential auction, distribution options. Presenters see estate management as another project plan. He even attached a proposed timeline. No mention of the recipes, no mention of laughter stitched into quilts, just cells and numbers. And again, I recognized his coping style, structured to fend off chaos. But to the rest of us, it looked like coldness. I realized then that the architect role wasn't optional anymore. Family systems without architects collapse into rival villages, each defending their corner of memory. So I drafted a different kind of plan, not about valuation, but about meaning. I proposed a gathering at the community center, not to divide, but to share. Each person could claim one object and tell its story aloud before taking it home. Archetypally, this was ceremony builder, turning division into ritual. If you've ever organized a workplace roundtable where everyone gets a voice, you know the method. Process becomes protection. When I floated the idea, reactions split. Aunt Linda scoffed. "Sounds like therapy." Dad replied with a curt, "Logistics?" But Kara, surprisingly, texted me, "It's beautiful. I think your mom would approve." That endorsement carried weight, not because of her role as wife, but because she was the only one speaking from empathy rather than control. Companions sometimes see the forest when everyone else fights over the trees. I booked the hall for Saturday. In the back of my mind, I knew the gathering could implode. Shadow boxers thrive on open mics, and custodians hate surrendering authority. Still, I sensed this was the pivot point. Either we ritualize the division into something bearable, or we let resentment calcify into family law. And if you've ever lived through a split where silence became the only inheritance, you know why I chose the harder path. As I pressed send on the invitations, I felt the architect's responsibility fully. Not to erase conflict, not to crown a winner, but to design a structure where multiple truths could stand without toppling. And underneath it all, a quieter thought pressed forward. Maybe this gathering wasn't only about mom's things. Maybe it was a test of whether we still recognized ourselves as a family at all. Saturday came with gray skies, fitting for the mood. The community center smelled of varnish and old coffee, and I set up a circle of chairs with a folding table in the middle. On it, I placed a quilt, a casserole dish, and the recipe cards, anchors for the ritual. If you've ever run a meeting that could collapse into chaos, you know the value of visual cues, objects that remind people why they're gathered. They arrived in waves. Aunt Linda first, arms crossed, the custodian ready to defend her claim. Then Dad and Kara, carrying boxes labeled with Mom's handwriting. Cousins trickled in, quieter than usual, uncertain of the script. That's the magic of ceremony builder spaces. By changing the room, you change the roles. Even the loudest shadow boxers looked subdued in the circle. I opened with what planners call a frame. These things don't just belong to us. They belong to the stories they carry. Today, before anything goes home, each person shares one story with one item. No debate, no cross-examination, just a ritual of telling. Archetypally, I was stepping into conductor mode, guiding tempo without dictating melody. Aunt Linda went first. She held a quilt, voice trembling, and spoke of winter evenings when Mom stitched while they watched sitcoms together. Her eyes softened, and for the first time, her custody looked less like control and more like longing. A cousin followed with a memory of chilly Fridays, laughter spilling into the driveway. Dad surprised me. He chose the Pyrex dish and admitted he never understood why Mom insisted on doubling recipes, until he realized she was feeding more than just us. Even Kara spoke. She picked up a photo frame and said quietly, "I didn't know her, but I know the love she left. I hope I can honor it by loving Richard well." The air shifted. You could feel it, the group moving from fracture to something closer to acknowledgement. Not unity, not harmony, but recognition. Each person walked away with an item, yes, but more importantly, with their piece of the story spoken aloud. And in systems, that's what prevents ghosts. Not the haunting kind, but the unspoken resentments that linger. As we stacked chairs at the end, Dad squeezed my shoulder. No performance this time, just weight in the gesture. Kara gave me a small nod of respect. Even Aunt Linda managed a subdued thank you. Walking out into the gray afternoon, recipe cards tucked in my bag, I realized the blueprint I'd been sketching all week wasn't perfect, but it held. That's the quiet triumph of the architect role. You don't erase the cracks, you design around them. Families don't heal into symmetry. They survive into new shapes. And while the center we'd lost could never be replaced, the circle we formed that day proved we still had the capacity to gather, to speak, and to hold, even when the sequence felt broken.